Yes, so I'm delighted to be joined once again by Zoltan Istvan, who is running once again for the US presidency, this time as a Republican. Now, the first thing I found very interesting about your website is that you seem to be almost concerned about the transhumanist movement, so that's people who think we should use technology to kind of artificially augment human capabilities. Is becoming dominated by the left, becoming dominated by socialist thought. I mean, is that part of the reason you decided to run as a Republican?
Well, that's one of the reasons. There's two reasons. That's the first one. I mean, I live in the Silicon Valley area, and I can tell you over a 10-year period of living there, it has changed dramatically. It's one thing to be left, but it's another thing to start going really hard left, almost socialist. And that's really what's worrying me. And so running, of course, as a Republican is a good way to straighten that out. The other problem, though, is that the Republicans tend to somewhat be anti-science or anti-technology. So while they might be, they like to make money and that's good, and they're fiscally conservative, they also could use some instruction, my opinion, humble opinion, that science and technology is a really good thing. And you don't need to be afraid of it. It doesn't need to challenge you. Republicans can be a party that also embrace science and technology and move it forward. And so those are really the two reasons that I'm running, because I think there's an opening for somebody like myself to maybe break into a major party and really get some recognition of changing it. And that so far the campaign is, I don't want to say it's a big hit, the campaign, but I've heard that there are plenty of higher up Republicans at least nodding that it exists and thinking a little bit about what a younger generation of fiscally conservative people want that are also interested in technology.
I mean, the comparison I think you used on your website that was very interesting was the environmental movement, which is, almost exclusively or heavily associated with the left. And your argument almost seems to be that conservatives need to get involved in transhumanism or they'll lose it to the left. I mean, do you think there's a very real risk that the transhumanist movement becomes almost exclusively the preserve of the left, and the conservatives kind of need to get involved more and should kind of drop any scruples they got about the movement?
Well, I think there's a huge danger of that. So when I began 6-7 years ago, kind of with the publishing of my book, The Transhumanist Wager, and then a lot of the articles that I wrote, and kind of the movement started growing as well, it was very much a libertarian movement and centered and mostly just kind of higher up academic. All of a sudden, the movement just grew dramatically, but it grew from the youth, and youth tend to be very left-leaning in the beginning. And I mean, I got to be honest, I was pretty hard left-leaning in my 20s as well. But then I had kids, and then I had a mortgage, and then I got married, and then all of a sudden, like, I started drifting towards the center where I'm probably kind of close to now. And I think, though, we have to be careful, because transhumanism, sort of like environmentalism, is a movement that the youth are pushing in terms of numbers. And that's sort of why I would love to get some of the older fiscally conservative people interested in transhumanism, because it might balance out those forces. As you pointed out, environmentalism is entirely run by the left. And, it's not good when we don't have balance. It doesn't really matter what the agenda is. I like to see both sides bash it out, work it out, confront each other, and then we can find kind of, the best place. But right now, if you have a movement only from the left, then it just creates this, kind of like the ship is leaning too much.
Yeah. I mean, what's the reaction? I mean, you kind of alluded to this a bit already, but what's been the reaction from kind of the mainstream American conservative movement? I mean, obviously, some of your positions on, I believe you're an atheist, which I think is quite unusual in the American right, less so in the British right. But what's kind of been the reaction from the mainstream American conservative movement?
Well, I tend to be quite socially liberal, or, I come from a libertarian background. And of course, libertarians are pro-LGBT, we're pro-choice, we're pro-immigration, we're usually secular or more secular minded, I'd say. We're about freedoms. We don't, and it's not that we necessarily believe this way or believe that way. We just simply believe people should have the freedom to do whatever they want. Now, conservatives tend to be really hardballed on certain types of ideas that really define who they are outside of being fiscally conservative. So that part has not gone very well. But I got to say that in my campaign, it's broken down by demographics. If the people are under 40 or under 45, they seem to be much more open to socially liberal values, even if they're Republican. If they're older, and I'd be honest with you, if they're just kind of like older men, white men, they tend to be, hey, I'm a Christian. these are the values I have, and you're coming into this party trying to take it over, and that's not what we're about. We're a party of values. And you know, I don't mean to get in the middle, but the truth of the matter is, I believe that if the Republican Party doesn't start waking itself up to some of the open-mindedness of the libertarian agenda, I would say, then the Republican Party might find itself very lost. Now, I'm not saying open yourself to everything. They don't have to agree with me, but the idea that they're still battling on some, you know, oh, we need to build a giant wall to keep out these people. You know, it's not even looking at the other side of the issue. I'm a pretty balance-centric guy, so I'm not, you know, trying to defend one way or the other, but a lot of people on the far right don't want to even talk to the left.
Yeah. Oh, it's kind of an associated question, but what's the reaction been within the transhumanist movement? Because I imagine there's probably some surprise when you ran as a Republican.
Well, yes, and it has been definitely damaging, I would say, to some extent, to my profile, that I've sort of worked quite hard, because I've enjoyed and I've been honored to be sort of a voice in the movement that can lead it forward and try to push it, especially as a journalist and whatnot. But so there's definitely been some damage, and we'll hope that when this is over, there'll be forgiveness. Or because I got to say, what's happened is I helped create this movement in the beginning by writing a lot of articles and books and whatnot, and doing a lot of interviews, and it grew with the left. And since I was centric, that was okay. Nobody really minded me being a libertarian, because you know, it didn't matter. But all of a sudden, when you declare yourself a Republican, oh wow, I could see the friend list on Facebook just shrinking by the minute. And so right now I'm working on, you know, trying to explain to people that there might be a good Republican in your future. I mean, after all, I'm not going out there, you know, pushing out the exact same things Trump is saying. I'm coming from a much more centric position. Let's work together. It doesn't matter if you're fiscally conservative or not fiscally conservative. We all still can share, you know, America together. And they see that, but I think the truth is, if you're not like for helping the poor with high taxes, then you're really in trouble as a Republican. And of course, since I'm fiscally conservative, I'm not. So I got to say, it's been tough. But the other angle is that I think some conservatives have come to the transhumanist movement through my campaign, and hopefully they're now part of it. And so maybe the movement itself will be better balanced as a result. But I know there's a lot of angry former supporters.
And one thing I found very interesting is one of your big issues is universal basic income, which obviously kind of you associate with Andrew Yang, generally seen as something of the left. It almost seemed to kind of trying to rescue the concept from the idea that it has to be statist and has to be left wing. Because obviously, I think your idea was a federal land dividend. I mean, could you kind of explain a little bit how that would work and how that would be different from the state dishing out money?
Well, so this is so interesting because, you know, first off, I like Mr. Andrew Yang. He seems to be doing a great job. He's really done an amazing job in spreading the idea of basic income. If nothing else from his campaign, everybody around the world knows about it now. And that's good, because I do think with automation coming and robots taking jobs and stuff like that in the 10, 20, 30-year future, basic income is probably the best way to go. I, however, don't want to raise taxes. You know, a policy of mine is just no raising taxes. In fact, let's shrink government and let's make it stronger just by being smaller. So I was looking at different ways to raise money for a basic income without technology. Some people say, oh, you can do it through like blockchain technology, and others say you can do it through different types of maybe you know, cryptocurrencies and whatnot. But the only formula that I really found that doesn't raise taxes, I believe in, is the federal land dividend. Now, every single country, doesn't matter if it's England or Germany or China or America, has an enormous amount of federal land that belongs apparently to the government itself. It really belongs to the people in a trust generally. In America, we have around 800 million acres. So this is enough money, maybe 150 to 200 trillion dollars. If you divide 150 trillion dollars of equity by 325 million Americans, you get $500,000 each. That means every American out there has $500,000 of equity. And yet it's a well-known fact that about 50% of Americans can't even come up with $1,000. So this is an amazing opportunity to monetize a lot of this federal land, to eliminate poverty, make sure that people can afford healthcare, maybe give them money for education, food, money for shelter, take care of the homeless. The interesting part about this is Trump is already doing a version of this plan. he is monetizing federal land. He's giving it to his big business buddies. And the only difference between him and me is I would give the money that we made back to the people, and Trump is letting the rich keep it and make themselves richer. But I think a lot of Republicans could accept my idea because the federal land dividend benefits big business because there's going to be more money made from it. And the Democrats are going to like it because it's going to help give out free money to end poverty. So it's really a bipartisan plan. I don't like the way Trump's doing it, but I like my idea where we would lease out to big business, and big business would then give that money back to the people itself and take a small profit.
Yeah. I mean, one other thing I found, so kind of the three main planks on your website are transhumanism, the universal basic income, or your way of doing it, and also kind of the fear of a coming, not so much conflict, but well, almost kind of rivalry with China, and a perception of China is perhaps starting to pull ahead of the West, or catch up with the West with the potential to pull ahead of the West in the technologies that transhumanists like, so AI and that kind of thing. I mean, how concerned are you about the kind of authoritarianism of China, and do you think that the transhumanist vision works quite well within an authoritarian system?
Well, I think first off, China has done a very good job of remaining authoritarian and yet having so many elements of private business and capitalism within it. Somehow they've really hit a magic stride because it turns out that maybe if you can hold power over people, but you just let them do whatever they want freely, and it actually works very well. And so that was never how communism operated. That's why communism failed. But this type of socialism, or their authoritarianism, better said, maybe like a new secret economy that it really works for them. The other thing that works for them, of course, they're 4 times America's population and giant, much bigger than most other countries as well. So they just have more man and woman power. I mean, they have as many engineers as almost American workers, or they soon will. So this just makes it very challenging. But the other thing they have is a very secular culture. They're just simply more accepting of saying, let's put a brain implant in your head if it makes my family more prosperous, because they don't have these kind of hangups that might say, oh, Jesus would not appreciate that, or Christianity, or Islam was same thing, or whatever. Whereas if you're secular, or even just like in India, the same thing. India is Hindu, and because they have so many gods in their pantheon, it's like to put a chip in one's head to become more prosperous. It's just to become like another god, potentially. So these two cultures, and naturally the 2 largest nations in the world per population, have, I think, a much more inclination to accept transhumanism. And China, of course, with the genetic editing children and whatnot, have moved forward in ways that America hasn't. I think there's really no catching up with China at this point, unless I was probably elected in 2020, which I think is a near impossibility, of course, because I don't think Trump, when he talks about making America great, there's really only one way to make America great compared to China at this point, since they have so much larger of a population than us. And that's to have brand new innovations, to put huge amounts of funding and benefits into AI, genetic editing, and recreate like almost a new type of industrial revolution with these things. But I don't think that's going to happen because Trump talks about walls and building auto factories, and this might seem like what American greatness used to be based on, but it's really what it's really based on is going to be the future, what Elon Musk is working on, things like that. Those are the things that make greatness. And if you look at the amount of unicorns, these $1 billion companies that China has compared to just 3-4 years ago, I mean, it's staggering the amount it's growing. So unless we can change our culture and get some a leadership in there that really wants to believe in the promise of science and technology, then I think, it's just a matter of 5 to 10 years before China becomes, kind of the strongest player in the world economically. And then, of course, culturally, that's going to trickle down, and we're going to have so much Chinese influence, both in media and everything else. So I hate to say this, it's not over yet, but we're in the 4th, quarter of a football game, and it's time's running out, and we're not going to win this game.
I mean, would you almost say that the kind of the liberal democratic capitalist model, the Western model, needs to evolve and become more open to tech and technological innovation in order to keep up with the Chinese authoritarian model? So obviously they got things like their social credit scheme. In the UK, there's a big debate at the moment about Huawei running part of our 5G network. I mean, do we need to become more open to tech if we're going to, remain level pegging with them?
Well, I think first off, yes, we just have to embrace it. Like one of the main things I've been working on is trying to get Christian culture to understand that transhumanism can be very much a part of that culture. Right now, you have to understand, like, when you talk about how the National Institute of Health in America operates, we're talking about Congress, all 535 members believing in an afterlife and believing in Judeo-Christian values. The same thing with the president, the vice president, and of course, all our 9 Supreme Court justices. They aren't thinking in terms of this, look, one day we could merge ourselves with machines and become something much greater. I'm not saying they have to think like that, but they at least have to say, you know what? We have China almost going to, create artificial intelligence. They're going to beat us to kind of this game winner in global, policy landscapes and whatnot. And we're afraid of this because it requires this new type of consciousness or this new type of entity or this new type of technology. America has to get over that and say, wait a sec, forget whether it bothers our moral values. We have a game to win here. And that game is to produce China, to remain wealthier than them, to be able to call the shots in a democratic world. And the reason that's very important is because otherwise, I believe that people will start accepting China's sort of social system, including its social credit system, which I don't approve of, and some of these other things. I don't want to live in a country where most people don't vote. I don't want to live in an authoritarian regime, even if it's a very functional place. I think a democracy can be just as functional. It just needs to overcome maybe some of its religious biases as well as some of its cultural biases and its conservatism. And I mean that not in the Republican sense, but the Republicans need to wake up and say, we can make a lot of money here. It's okay to be transhumanist. And that's what I'm really trying to do. I think the Democrats sort of get that. The only problem with the Democrats, they just want to regulate everything. And that's, of course, another problem, too. But I think if there would be a better balance, then maybe the Republicans would say, okay, let's make America great again through science and technology. Because you can't win the world by making cars anymore. You can't win the world by, even making bombs anymore. That's just not how it is. These days, it's coding, it's computers, it's the brand new science, genetic. These are the industries that will be driving the 10, 20, 30-year future. So if you're not leading it, then you're not winning that game.
I mean, would you almost say that kind of the continued primacy of democracy worldwide, or the kind of the democratic West, relies on the West embracing transhumanism and the technologies transhumanists advocate? And if they don't, we're just going to get left behind, essentially.
Well, there's no question we're going to get left behind, and then it will happen because I believe probably the Chinese, and it's not just the Chinese, it's the Asian mentality of just this. I don't know if you know the story of the Tiger Mom. The Tiger Mom is this mother who really raises her children very, very strictly, but then they all go to the best schools and they're super smart. Well, America has grown somewhat lazy. Let's just be honest. And they want so many unions and they want so much free this, and some of them are now clamoring for 4-day work weeks. Look, I want to give everybody the easiest life as well too, but that's not what China's doing. So we have to make a choice. Do we want to be competitive against China, or do we want to just have the good life? And how long can the good life last if China in 30 years becomes this great world power and then says, it's possible they could swallow America? I mean, they literally will have probably 5 times the population at some point within a 30-year span of us. So if they take off economically, it could be game over in terms of whether America even has any influence whatsoever. Now, this is I'm not saying this is going to happen, but this is my main message to the Republicans: is this is not about making America great. This is about America winning in this game that we're in. And that game is technology, it's code, it's radical things that might scare you like genetic editing, but that's where the future is going to lie in all of medicine and in probably warfare with cybersecurity and AI and things like that. So we got to get on with that if we want to win this kind of race, at least remain a world figure. And, I don't think China is even worried, because would you be worried knowing you're going to have 5 times the population than us, and you have as many engineers who, and again, going back to their culture, they just simply work dramatically harder than us. And the reason is it's built into their culture. They don't have these union things ideas yet. They don't have these kind of and again, I'm not criticizing those ideas. I think kind of where America has ended up is a very nice place. You have these benefits. But that's not the tiger mom. The tiger mom doesn't care if the child is happy. The tiger mom only cares if the child ends up with honors from Harvard University. And that's what's not here in America anymore, is we've lost that work ethic where the entire country drives to kind of do something great. And I think China has captured that work ethic. And since they're so much more populated than us, I just can't see it ending good for the West.
I mean, one thing that I've kind of noticed myself, I mean, this may just be my perception, is that a lot of Western leaders don't seem to be thinking, they think quite short term, so that there's not so much to thinking about what's going to happen in 20, 30, 40 years. Whereas some authoritarian leaders like Xi Jinping, Putin, saying that, the future of the world will be determined by who dominates AI. It seems that some of the authoritarian leaders are thinking more about the longer term challenges and the longer term questions than some of our democratic leaders. I mean, in the West, it seems it's almost the tech billionaires are the people that are really pushing this stuff forward. I mean, would you agree with that? And if so, why do you think that's the case? Why do you think our democratic leaders are so behind the curve on this?
Well, I think to begin with, China and Russia have been playing catch up to America. So they've been looking for unique ways to take us over. And they probably thought this 5 or 10 years ago and figured this was a good way. And now that's playing out. And in 5 and 10 years, that's how it's going to win. I think also, when you look at things historically, benevolent dictatorships often actually tend to outdo other types of political systems because you do have a single leader who can see far into the future. However, that's not something that I would want, but it is a realistic possibility. Of course, if the benevolent dictator all of a sudden doesn't become benevolent anymore, then the entire empire can fall. And that's also what's happened. And that's why we have kind of resorted to democracy, which is a better and safer system over the long haul. However, there are certain advantages right now. And I think, when you talk about President Xi and other things that they're doing forward, I mean, they simply, in China, I think, have this kind of vision of what they want, and they come out with these plans like AI 2030 and whatever, and they're spending so much money on it, and there's so much opportunity for young engineers and young scientists to make fortunes. It's just like going back 100 years in America, where I think that's why America became so powerful so quickly, is there were fortunes to be made. There are fortunes to be made in China. It's not so easy anymore to make a fortune in Silicon Valley. People are actually leaving the startup culture because it's kind of become saturated. So I think those are a number of the reasons why, but certainly, just we have leadership that just, Trump is not a science and tech guy. And that is dramatically important in terms of where the future is. And even in this, with the coronavirus, I was, I've gone out on Twitter a few times, said, we really do need somebody who not just is thinking, oh, when a virus comes to the States, we'll deal with it. We needed somebody who said, wait a sec, let's have a universal vaccine. There are a ton of different kinds of companies working on this, but they get very little funding and nobody really cares about it. A government should have perhaps stepped in and said, how can we help develop a universal vaccine so we can't get anything from China? These are the things, if the government really, and again, I'm about small government, but if the government cares about one thing, it ought to care about your health, your longevity. And these are things where I do think instead of maybe bombing Afghanistan, we ought to be worrying about a universal vaccine for some of these viruses and things like that. I mean, that's my take. But of course, Trump's not thinking that. He's thinking bigger nuclear weapons and bigger greatness, and let's build more bullets and tanks and, go to Iran and this kind of thing. And I care much more about the health of the American people, and that's a very different kind of take.
I mean, it kind of feels like we're almost on the verge of a second kind of grey age of human space exploration. I mean, there's so much planned in terms of, moon bases and a trip to Mars and so on. And I guess one of the fundamental questions, and a question that relates to the transhumanist movement, is how that should all be organised. I mean, should it be done on kind of a nation-state basis, or should it be done as a species-wide endeavour? I mean, what are your thoughts were on that?
Well, I think it's nice to say species-wide, of course, but I also think that that's probably unrealistic just because, sorry, I lost you there for a sec, but I think it's probably best to have capitalism move forward the way it has so far. Don't get me wrong, I like the idea that we all do things all together, but it's just, it's not something that we've had much success with, especially when you're talking about going to Mars and who gets it first, and not so much who gets it first or who gets the pride of planning their things first. And so I think those are some of the those are some of the things that would make us want to just maybe just do it in America versus other. Maybe there can be some collaboration working together, but I find it almost impossible that China and America or Russia would work together. This is a race in a way, and races tend to be very good when they're competitive in a friendly manner. Actually, that said, I mean, obviously, as you look at through my 20-point policy, you know that I do support discussion of a world government. I think at some point we are going to get to a point when it doesn't make sense to have borders. It doesn't make sense to have all these different languages. It's too complex, and money is best made just through easy free flow of stuff. So maybe a democratically elected government, and especially this is one way I think that we might be able to overcome China should China get too powerful, is to have all the West band together and say, look, we're now much more powerful than you could ever be. That said, we still don't have the numbers. It's like, even if Europe and all of Europe and all of America and all of Canada and Mexico combined, we're still only 2/3 the amount of population of China. However, we then have the stronger economics, and that could, help maybe try to establish some type of world democracy. That is something that I am open to discussion for. It's not something I'm pushing in my presidency that I would try to achieve, but I think as we move forward in a society, especially with weird things like the singularity coming and AI that has its own consciousness, I think at some point we might be able to consider those things in a real way, and see if that could be something that might end all wars and maybe help, I think, dramatically domestic violence issues, help women, help a lot of different issues that we have worldwide by a more central, democratic kind of legal system that pervades everywhere. And then, deal with homeless and stuff like that as well.
Yeah. I mean, just one final question. So in kind of 30 or 40 years' time, how different do you think human civilization will be?
In 40 years' time from now?
Yeah.
Wow. It does depend on various factors. Like, for example, if the coronavirus just took out everyone and there's just some of us left, okay, no, hopefully that, of course, won't happen. And hopefully a giant asteroid won't happen, because I do believe there are a number of existential risks out there. But I think it would be virtually unrecognizable within 40 years. I think 30 years is a better estimate. I think 30 years, you and I will have some metal parts as we're talking to each other, cyborg eye. We won't be using computers as accessories. We'll be talking to each other directly from inside our brains. I think that would be happening, but we'd still be physical entities as we are now. But you go out 40, 50 years, I think it makes sense to start uploading one's consciousness, or being totally different biological creatures, not one that need to breathe air or rely on, whether it's cold or hot outside, or, I think you kind of come to something almost like the Star Wars age, where we could recreate ourselves genetically. And if we did so, we would probably be very different than we are now. I mean, there's a lot of problems with the human body, but I think more so we end up inside the clouds. We end up in virtual worlds. We end up with our consciousness expanding through merging with other consciousnesses and whatnot. Again, this is sort of why I do support this idea of a global government at some point in the future, because when you look at where technology go, America doesn't survive, and neither does China. I mean, maybe they survive, they swallow everyone else, but at some point it's no longer even recognizable to what it once was, because things like the singularity start happening, or we merge our brains with an AI consciousness that's so much smarter than us that we end up being something very, very different. And then all the laws of democracy, the US Constitution, all these other things probably fall away, as we have to create brand new ideas, and they're probably so complex and bizarre to us now that they'll almost be unrecognizable. But I think within a 40-year window, a lot of that stuff is happening and is certain to happen soon after.